I know. It's just automatic. It's just constant. Changes to the changes. It's right. Well, that's the other thing.
We will.
Oh yeah.
this morning, Justice of the Supreme Court, the Honorable Angelina Sandoval Gutierrez.
Good morning, everyone. May I now call on stage our speakers for the first plenary session on liberty and prosperity. To share with us the Canadian experience, I am pleased to call on stage the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Honorable Beverly McLachlin. Enlightening us with the international bar experience is the President of the International Bar Association, Mr. Fernando Pombo. Finally, the speaker will share with us the Singaporean perspective. Please welcome Justice of the Supreme Court of Singapore, the Honorable Chu Han Tek. Chief Justice Artemio V. Panganiban, the Honorable Chief Justice Hilario G. Davida Jr., and other colleagues in the great fraternity of jurists, distinguished delegates from the International Bar Associations, foreign academe, business chambers, civil societies, legislature and executive departments, our developmental partners, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning again and welcome to the first plenary session. Judge Learned Hand succinctly described in his discourse on liberty, right knows no boundaries and justice, no frontiers. The brotherhood of man is not a domestic institution. This day is an affirmation of such statement that we, men and women of diverse race and culture, gather here in the name of liberty and prosperity. Our session now only attests that poverty and tyranny oppress all nations, rich and poor alike, and that liberty and prosperity are indeed common concerns of mankind. The Philippine judicial policy on liberty and prosperity is likened to the United States double standard of judicial review. The latter standard has been defended and argued by prominent jurists such as Holmes, Brandeis, Cardozo, and Stone. But still, it faces lot of challenges and haunting doubts. The question posed to us is, should we adopt liberty and prosperity as policy imperatives? The answer depends on the ideas to be advanced by our panel of discussants. The Philippines is fortunate that three finest legal minds came all the way from three different continents: North America, Europe, and Asia to be in this morning's panel session. By the way, may I remind the speakers that to effectively manage the time allotted for each presentation, we shall be installing a flashing timer, which you now see beside the speaker's podium. The green light signals the start of your presentation. When you notice the yellow light, this means you have only 3 minutes left. And the red light indicates you have only 1 minute left. We hope you will be guided accordingly. Thank you. Our first speaker is a strong pillar in Canada's justice system. After practicing law in the late 60s, our guest moved to British Columbia, where she was called to the bar. In 1981, her stint in the bench started. She was appointed to the County Court of Vancouver. 5 months thereafter, she was appointed to the Supreme Court of British Columbia. She was named Chief Justice of that court in 1988. In 1989, she was sworn in as the third woman to serve as a Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. And on January 7, 2000, she became its first Chief Justice. Won't you give that a round of applause? That is indeed woman power in the world. In one of her speeches, our speaker emphasized that it was only in 1929, in the famous Persons case that is in Canada, that the law recognized Canadian women as persons entitled to hold public office. Taking into account her record of public service, I can say she has proven the wisdom of the Parsons case. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Right Honorable Madam Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin.
Thank you, Chief Justice, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you here all today at this forum on liberty and prosperity. And I'd like to especially thank Chief Justice Panganiban for inviting me to say a few words to you. I believe this is an important conference and important and significant times in the shared history of the various countries represented here. I've been asked to talk about the Canadian experience in liberty and prosperity, a rather large subject, so you'll forgive me if I touch on only certain aspects. But having been asked to talk about a Canadian experience, I thought I'd talk about a story that's a Canadian story, and it's a personal story. I grew up in a very small community in a sparsely populated part of Canada in southwestern Alberta, near the Rocky Mountains, for any of you who may have lived it, just south of Banff. And we had a story in our family that, for me, introduced me to the idea of that abstract concept, the rule of law. My paternal grandparents had come from Northern Europe and spoke German just after the First World War and settled in Canada. And then the Second War came along, and with it all the suspicion of anyone who had come from that part of the world. So one day, my grandmother answered the door and found two policemen, mounted policemen, we call them Mounties, standing at her door. They had no warrant, and without a warrant, they demanded to search the house. So they went through the house from top to bottom, finding nothing. They finally came up to the attic in the very top room, and there they found a scrapbook that my grandmother had been keeping, uncompleted, with various pictures of the British royal family. My grandmother simply said, in her rather broken English, "We's Canadians," and that said it all. Now, what if that got to do with the rule of law, you ask? Well, it was, as I said a moment ago, my earliest encounter with the rule of law. The story was about a lot of things. It was about fear, it was maybe about discrimination, but in the way it was told by the family, as I heard it told as a little girl, it was a story about a violation of the rule of law. And to my aunts and uncles and grandparents, this was very important because they had come to Canada for the very reason that they wanted to live in a country that had the rule of law. So perhaps that's why I ended up becoming a lawyer. From my earliest days, I understood that in some countries it was easier to find the rule of law, whatever that was, than in others. Today, in the brief time I have, I'd like to touch on three things. First, a little about the rule of law in my country and generally. Secondly, the rule of the law as it relates to the theme of this conference, liberty and prosperity. And thirdly, what we can do, we as judges, we as government people, whatever our role as individuals, to further the rule of law and hence liberty and prosperity. Well, a lot of things have been said and written about the rule of law, and the definitions that have been offered could keep us here all morning. But I say quite simply that the core of the rule of law rests in this simple proposition, that everybody who acts in a society that exercises power in any way, public and private, individual and institutional, are subject to and governed by legal norms. Everybody. The law isn't for some and not for others. It's there for everyone, from the highest government official to the humblest person in the street. That is the all-pervasive concept of the rule of law that I believe is essential to grasp. And it means that when a policeman knocks on your door, even if he thinks he'll get legitimate entrance in my country or he's stronger, that policeman still has to go, in my country at least, to get the warrant first. The rule of law in this sense is all pervasive. It is a concept that insists on legality binding the government and pervading every executive act, the act of every policeman, the act of every judge, the act of every prison official, the act of every civil servant. All of these must think of themselves not as people exercising power in their own name or perhaps for some good that they think they'll be able to achieve, or perhaps out of anger and retribution, but as servants of the rule of law that underlies their state. In this sense, the rule of law is the embodiment of the contract between the citizen and citizen and the citizen and the state, and it sets up a series of mutual obligations. And our goal and the ultimate aim of this is to be able to live together in harmony in the framework of the law. Let me tell you a little bit about how my country developed the rule of law, because every country has its own path to the rule of law. There's no such thing as one recipe or one formula that fits every country. Canada started off as a colony, more accurately 2 colonies. A French colony of some million people where people spoke French in Quebec and somewhat in Acadia, and a large English-speaking colony. England won the wars of the 18th century and hence took over. But they had to make an accommodation unusual for those days because of the strength and obstinacy and loyalty to their language and customs and religion, the Catholic religion, of the French minority. And so ultimately they passed an act after much travail, which was unique in the world at that time, I believe, the Quebec Act of 1774, which said The Quebec people can keep their religion, they can keep their language, and we'll all try to live together. Two very different cultures, or nations if you want to use it in that sense, living together. And that was our foundation, and we made that into a country in 1867 through our Constitution. All that, of course, overlain on a background of many Aboriginal peoples who had to be accommodated and brought into the fabric of society. And more recently, we've become a huge country of immigration, with people coming from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia. So we have this complex group of communities that we have within our nation, and who are all under this umbrella of the rule of law. And the rule of law starts with our Constitution, and which has been added to in 1982 with our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a constitutional Bill of Rights. I can say, I think unequivocally, that in my country, the law has been, and the rule of law has been, a unifying force. It has brought French and English together and kept them together. It has been a force that has allowed Aboriginal peoples to be brought into the fold of the nation and find retribution and recognition and compensation for the wrongs that may have been done them. It is an institution to which new Canadians who may find themselves feeling discriminated or left out can have recourse. The law provides not only a way to find solutions and accommodations between the diverse groups in my country, but it is a space of conversation where, win or lose, people come together to talk about their problems, about their differences, and about, at the bottom of it, why they want to be Canadians. There's a point I want to make here, and that is a critical distinction between the rule of law, which is what I've been talking about, what I hope we have in our country, Canada, and the rule by law. Rule by law is something different in my mind. Rule by law takes a lot less work, a lot less energy, and is a lot less democratic. Rule by law can happen when any dictator decides, here's my code, I'm going to impose it on the people. There is a law in place, that is rule by law. Rule of law is something much more culturally rooted in the country. Rule of law connotes that even that supreme ruler or group of rulers is subject to the law and governs with the will of the people, with the permission of the people, for as long as the people want to have that person subject to the usual rules on elections and so on. Rule of law includes a democratic principle. It includes a principle of equality, that every citizen has equality, basic equality, men and women as well. It includes basic liberties, foremost and of ultimate importance for a democracy, the liberty of freedom of speech, but also liberties to be free from arbitrary detention, from being picked up in the middle of the night and thrown into jail and so on. Liberties that are not always easy to work out in this complex society of ours, where we have threat of terrorism, where we may have crime, where we maybe have groups working outside the law. Yet our commitment to working these things out within the law lies at the heart of the rule of law. The rule of law is something every citizen has an entitlement to. There's an ethic of justification. The citizen can go to court against the government if necessary and win. And that, of course, presupposes a fair justice system, and it presupposes an independent judiciary, a judiciary which cannot be removed at pleasure, which is in no one's pocket and no one's corner. So there, in a nutshell, is the image of the rule of law that I have taken from the experience in our country. Much different than the rule by law. Now, the second part of my comments takes me to how this ties in to A, liberty, and B, prosperity. Liberty is quite straightforward, and you have heard a lot of it already, and you will hear a lot more. The rule of law gives every individual a space, a dignity, a value, and that is the source of all liberty. The person is not a chattel. The person is not simply a piece of dirt that one can walk on. Every person has dignity and liberty and a space in which they can act. And so we have many liberties of which we can talk, but we think, for example, in my country, and I think in most countries represented here, of justice in our courts, as the right, as I alluded to a moment ago, of the citizen to go forward into the courts and have their day in court. We think of equality and the other side of equality, which is freedom from discrimination. And we think of that equality not only in legal sense, we think of it in the sense, I think it was Justice Kennedy referred to it in the conference, of enough prosperity to be able to get to the point where your next worry is not whether you're going to have something to eat for dinner or supper tonight, so that you can have the liberty not only to survive, but to dream, to act in your society, to realize your full humanity. Liberty also entails freedom, as I mentioned, from arbitrary death and detention. Freedom of religion, so important to so many in the world. And all the other liberties that permit us to make the personal choices that define us as human beings. We speak less often, until late at least, about the connection between the rule of law and prosperity. But these two are profoundly linked in many ways. Now, there's two versions of the linkage between the rule of law and prosperity that are put forward. The first is the narrow version. And the version here is that the rule of law means that there will be rules that govern contracts, there will be judges that enforce those, and therefore business people who seek to enter into new arrangements will have the confidence that if they make a contract, that will be enforced in the courts. And this is a very reputable and important aspect of the link between the rule of law and prosperity. It started with English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who argued that without a judicial system, traders would be reluctant to enter into wealth-enhancing exchanges for fear that the bargain would not be honored. No assurance the other will perform after, because the bonds of words are too weak to bridle men's ambitions, avarice, anger, and other passions, without the fear of some coercive power. So you need the state, you need the law. And 20th century development economists have revived Hobbes' thesis. Douglas North asserts the absence of low-cost means of enforcing contracts is the most important source of both historical stagnation and contemporary underdevelopment in the world. That's a big statement, but one made after very serious study and consideration in his book, Institutions, Institutional Change and Economic Performance, published by the Cambridge University Press in 1990. And I could give you many more quotes. Support for Hobbes' theories also comes from world experiences. A World Bank poll has said that people in Peru said they wouldn't switch from a trusted supplier to a new one for fear the new supplier wouldn't be held to the bargain. In other words, is not great for expansion of the economy, for building new and diverse relations that we know a modern economy must have to compete and prosper, a dealer or whatever, and that contract will be enforced. And that is fundamental to prosperity. But there is another way to look at the link between the rule of law and prosperity, and much broader sense as the backdrop against which investment and development can really flourish. It's not just the individual contract here, it's the whole culture that supports the rule of law, that makes a country a good place to do business. A country where employees feel empowered, where people are educated, where the legal system ensures that there is a stable government transfer when elections happen, where the legal backdrop has ways of dealing with disputes between sectors of the community. All that stability, all that security that comes with the rule of law is, in a larger sense, very important to. Even in the 15th century, jurist John Fortescue asserted that medieval England's prosperity was traceable to the quality of its general legal institutions. And more recently, in a survey of 3,600 firms in 69 countries, more than 70% of the respondents said that an unpredictable judiciary was a major problem in their business operations. Other studies cast the net more widely to the stability of the society in general. I mention what I see at the core of the rule of law. I've tried to link it to the two ideas of liberty and prosperity, which we will be discussing at our meeting these 2 days. The question, however, is, how do we strengthen the rule of law and thus improve the liberties of people, thus improve the prospects of nations for growth and prosperity? A number of people and institutions are addressing this difficult question, and it is one I think that we may fruitfully consider at this meeting. It has already been considered. You heard, I believe, Justice Kennedy ask, what do we as judges do? How can we make a difference? Well, one of the things that is happening is that world institutions and NGOs and other international groups are taking this challenge to develop the rule of law very seriously. The World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and others, for example, insist on improvements to legal and judicial systems before providing assistance with development projects, for independent judicial review and all the core components of the rule of law. In fact, rule of law reform in developing countries is considered so vital that it is becoming a major category of international aid. And I know my country, Canada, through CEDA, has been participating in a number of these initiatives, and we are very, very happy that over the last 4 years or so, we have had a rich, I believe, and for us at least, very, very important exchange with our Philippine judicial counterparts as we talk about things like alternate dispute resolution to clear backlogs in clogged courts, judicial education for judges who might not otherwise get it, and even discuss more important structural and administrative reforms within the courts. This is the sort of thing that is happening on many fronts, with the assistance often of nations or international groups. And thus we will, I believe, in the years to come, see throughout the world an increase in development of the rule of law and an increase in people's liberties and prosperity as a result. There are many judges in this room, and what can we do as judges? Well, first of all, we can participate, as has been suggested earlier this morning, as educators. Judges are educators in a lot of ways. We have several Canadian judges here in Manila now, I believe it's Manila, who are helping to work with ADR and other projects, helping to share our experience in Canada with making justice more easy for poor and disadvantaged with people in the Philippines. That's one kind of judicial education. We also have developed electronic modules that we can send abroad or use within our own. And a judge can access these at any time if he has a particular problem. That's another form of judicial education. We have conferences such like as this where we share ideas. And through our day-to-day work, judges educate. Probably the best way a judge can educate is by his or her example. By showing in everything the judge does his or her integrity, her devotion to the law, her commitment to the rule of law. Which brings me to the second but related way in which judges can contribute to the rule of law: the exemplary discharge of their day-to-day judicial role. Judges have an extremely important role in ensuring that democracy succeeds, that liberties are safeguarded, and that the rule of law, so essential to prosperity, is maintained. I've already mentioned the fact that judges using the law can often find accommodations and solutions between adverse groups within society. I've told you how in Canadian society we have different groups who don't share the same views, the same ideals from time to time, and how we have used the law, the ability of these people to sue or be sued, to get an answer from a judge, to develop these or to deal with these problems. One of the more recent examples came after a very close vote on secession from the province of Quebec. And the government, after this vote, the federal government, referred a question to the court as to whether a part of the country, a province, could secede from the country unilaterally. It was called a secession reference. We don't have a provision in our Constitution, unlike some others, for a part of the country to secede. And so the court had to answer this very, very difficult question. It was a vitally important case for the future of our country. And we as judges approached it with that full sense of responsibility on our shoulders, in humility, in the sense that whatever we do, we must do for the good of the country, while remaining true to the law. And we worked on it for a long time, and in the end we produced a decision that said yes, no, they cannot secede unilaterally. But we said, if there were a significant majority, we didn't define what that was, we felt it was getting too political, on a clear majority, on a clear question, then the governments in our tradition of democracy would be required to sit down and negotiate. In other words, not revolution, not war. Given our long history together, there would be an implied legal obligation to sit down and negotiate and talk. And that decision was well received by both sides. I mention it only as an example. You, in whatever country you come from, may at some point be required to play an important role in where your country is going in terms of how different groups in that country can continue to coexist and live together in dignity and harmony. Judges, of course, also from time to time have an important role to play at transition points in government, when one government is being succeeded by another after an election. These are very difficult roles for judges to play and require the utmost courage and independence. They have to be played out in a non-political way. I was told a story by the chief of a constitutional court in a country in Africa. The constitutional court is their election court. It had been an election, and the ruler was not happy with the outcome. So he called in the whole of the Constitutional Court, and they didn't know what to do. They said, independence of the judiciary, should we go, shouldn't we go? Finally, the Chief Justice says, we go, but we all go together. So the whole court went, not just the Chief Justice who had been asked to go. The whole court went, and they sat down in his office. And he looked at them, and there was a silence, and I guess he didn't know what to say. And the president of the court said, Monsieur le Président, it was in French, you do what you have to do, we will do what we must do. And the whole court got out and walked out. And so there can be moments, not perhaps in my country, but in different countries where confrontations can happen. And even if it's less dramatic than that, the role of judges is very, very important. We recently saw a very close election in Mexico, and the loser was very unhappy, and there were riots in the streets. Some of the people were very unhappy. But Mexico had set up a system of tribunals which were respected. They had outside monitoring of the vote. The people were able to be satisfied, even those who lost and were grieving the loss, that the result was a fair democratic result. And it all rested on those judges and the integrity and respect they had in the society. So there's another area where judges have to play a very special role. And of course, in our day-to-day decisions, in dealing with the difficult matters we must deal with, we live in an ever-increasingly complex world, and we as judges from time to time will face issues where the stakes that are put against the putative liberty of the subject are very high. Terrorism, the threat to our society, of the public of whole, of public security, of people who may or may not be intent on terrible acts. These place judges in very difficult situations. But I believe that through this all, we must be true to the rule of law. The rule of law is a concept that we have had since the Magna Carta. It has served us well in our country and in the English history through many crises. It has from time to time been attempted to be subverted, set aside, but it has always come back. It is our surest guarantee in a troubled world. I thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts with you.